Today I want to talk about gene drives, a new, exciting, but controversial technology. I present you with this image from Jurassic Park, a classic film where humans attempt to clone dinosaurs in a controlled and confined environment. Spoiler alert, the dinosaurs break out of their confinement and wreak havoc. This analogy is to help illustrate some of the implications involved with gene drives, but this will make more sense to you as we move on in our discussion. So let's talk about what gene drives are. A key to understanding gene drives is understanding inheritance. Natural inheritance, or some of you may have heard the term Mendelian genetics, is where an offspring has an equal chance of inheriting any trait from either parent. In most cases, the dominant trait will express itself. This is depicted by the yellow mosquitoes. You can see that most of the offspring haven't inherited this yellow trait. Gene drives, on the other hand, ignore natural inheritance laws. Scientists found a way to edit the genome so that they can almost guarantee that a trait is always inherited. This means that virtually all subsequent offspring will receive that trait. This is depicted by the red mosquitoes. As you can see on the right, all of the offspring have received this red trait. So, in essence, a gene drive is something that literally drives a gene through an entire species. It's important to note at this point that gene drives can only work on species that reproduce sexually. This means that they are not effective on bacteria or viruses. So why are we talking about mosquitoes? Mosquitoes are a prime target species for gene drives because they carry and transmit diseases to humans. Take malaria, for example. Malaria causes over 1 million deaths a year, most of them are children, and half the world's population is at risk for this disease. What's more is that most of these populations are vulnerable, meaning that they lack the resources to access the drug therapy that they need. This is a social equity issue. Gene drives offer a potential solution. We can engineer mosquitoes with a resistance to malaria. This means that we could mitigate or even possibly eliminate completely malaria in the future. This all sounds good, but there are other promising case studies. Ticks that carry Lyme disease could be altered. Mosquitoes not only transmit malaria to people, but also to birds. This means that gene drives can have implications for our conservation efforts. Gene drives can also be used to combat invasive species. Take the common house mouse, for example. It is found to be the leading cause of extinction on islands like New Zealand. Gene drives are being investigated as an alternative to rodenticides, which are costly, toxic, and often carry adverse effects to the environment and other organisms. Gene drives could also have applications in agriculture. Amaranth is considered an invasive species, and it has become resistant to herbicides. Gene drives are a potential solution to control these weeds, although this example is a little bit more controversial, and I'll get back to this later. So now we've covered some of the positive case studies on gene drives, but I wouldn't be painting you a fair picture without discussing some of the more concerning case studies. So those mosquitoes that we were talking about? Well, scientists are looking at 2 ways to help stop the spread of malaria. The first is by employing a gene drive that builds resistance to malaria. This means that the mosquitoes wouldn't carry it. The problem is that mosquitoes are already developing resistance to this in laboratory settings. Much like bacteria develops resistance to an antibiotic, making it less effective over time. Some scientists think that this resistance is inevitable, that organisms will continue to adapt. The second method is engineering organisms to pass on an infertility gene. This will make numbers in the population dwindle. But the problem is that it could eventually lead to the collapse of the entire population. Eradicating a population completely is likely to have more drastic impacts on the ecosystem. The researcher at Harvard who first suggested fertility-reducing drives stated this past week that he regrets this idea. His concern arises from a study that he completed that confirms a long suspected risk associated with gene drives. That is, that the altered genes might spread to places where a species is not considered invasive, but is instead a well-established part of the ecosystem. So there can be cascading effects of this. This Harvard researcher labeled gene drives as remarkably aggressive. They found that it would take just a few altered organisms to alter an entire population. Biological studies are traditionally conducted in field tests. These field tests are done under controlled conditions in confined areas. However, the researchers found that this simply cannot be the case with gene drives, because species don't follow our human-invented boundaries. This is where I want to bring us back to our Jurassic Park analogy. Much like in the movie, where the dinosaurs escape their confinement, become aggressive, and wreak havoc, gene drives could have the same potential if proper protocol is not followed. The good news is that there are some researchers investigating a gene drive that self-destructs after several generations. However, this is unconfirmed because the research is so new. So now I want to take an overview of the good and bad of gene drives. On the one hand, we could potentially eliminate diseases from the face of the earth. We could eliminate or reduce the need for pesticides and herbicides or other chemicals that are harmful to our environment. We can control invasive populations. And most importantly, we can make great contributions to research. It can deepen our understanding of genetics. However, on the other hand, species can develop resistance to these things. Eventually, it could lead to us making a species completely extinct. And there's a whole lot of unknowns and potential unintended consequences. I'll be coming back to that point in just a bit. So the reality of the situation is that we cannot know the effects of gene drives with 100% certainty until they are released in the wild. So with this, we absolutely need to accept that by releasing gene drives into the wild, we are turning the Earth into a living laboratory, and we must acknowledge the possible consequences. For this reason, gene drives have a lot of ethical implications. For one, gene drives are inherently anthropocentric. Anthropocentrism is the view that humans are more important than all other species. This brings up a lot of questions, such as, do we have the right to control other species solely for our own benefit? Do we have the right to eradicate a whole species? Who gets to determine what is a pest? It turns out that amaranth I mentioned earlier, it has remarkable nutritional properties. This plant has value, yet someone determined that it was a weed and that it needed to be eradicated. My assumption is that this plant is destroying agricultural profits. So where do we draw the line? Should anyone be able to release a gene drive to suit their own needs? This also brings up some questions about informed consent. In research, informed consent is the idea that any participant is aware of their participation and that they agree to it. The problem with gene drives is that if one nation releases a gene drive, a neighboring country would quickly become part of the experiment, whether they liked it or not. This brings up the notion of unintended consequences. More appropriately, I would like to label these speculations. Think about the domino effect. Everything in nature is connected. Therefore, it makes sense that if we affect one part of the chain, that we could see effects in another. Now more than ever, we live in a globalized world, and species don't follow our human-invented boundaries. So this brings up room for things like genetic crossover. Take the liger, for example, part lion, part tiger. Genes could interact between species in unintended ways and in ways that we don't understand. Another cause for concern is corruption, especially within corporations. When I think about Monsanto, I think about how they've made their entire profit off patenting genetically modified organisms. So we already know that genetic modification has been exploited for profit. There is no guarantee that gene drives won't suffer the same fate, and there's no guarantee that the people implementing them will be doing it for the greater good. Additionally, biological warfare is a concern. The lab setup needed for gene drives is low cost and it's easy to find the materials. On top of that, the science isn't all that hard. And coupled with the aggressive nature of gene drives, well, this really creates concern for exploitation. At this point, I want to note that these hopes and fears are based on speculation and not empirical research. So in the end, gene drives may not be as promising or dangerous as expected. So what should we do? Well, I say stop, slow down, and proceed with extreme caution. At this point, I would like to make it known that I personally am against gene drives. I tend to take a non-anthropocentric stance, meaning that I think it's wrong for us to exploit other species simply for our own human benefit. However, I am not opposed to gene drive research. Research helps us better understand the world around us. And with gene drives, we can gain a better understanding of genetics and a better understanding of things like drug resistance. So this research does have value. But before we open Pandora's box, we really need to think about the ethical implications, and we really need to be careful about the laws and governance surrounding this technology. And I really think that nothing should be done until this is addressed. Thank you. I hope that you enjoyed this presentation.